This week's Talent Insight segment, we're going to be discussing a very important topic, which is the distinction between recruiting and retention. So let's just kind of dive right into it, because I know you and I have
Yeah.
been chatting about this specific topic for quite some time. We're excited to dig into it a little bit more today, but from our standpoint, this isn't a super common occurrence for us here at Hirewell, but there's definitely instances when a candidate that we're working with that we place at one of our clients doesn't work out. Sometimes this is like after a few weeks or maybe even a couple months. Sometimes it's after a year, they don't stay
Right.
there past that mark. When a candidate does not work out, a company is normally left wondering what went wrong. And the question that always comes up is, was this a recruiting issue or an issue of retention?
Yeah. And I think in order to consider if a candidate, we'll call it like
Mhm.
a candidate fall off, if it
Right.
happens. I'm not sure if that's an internal term, but like a fall off meaning like the candidate does not last at the company. So
Mhm.
in order to kind of consider if a candidate's fall off is due to recruiting or retention, I feel like we kind of have to take a step back and like define the two, right? Starting with recruiting. Like recruitment allows
Mhm.
you to carefully identify the talented individuals that will make up your team, right? Finding the
Exactly.
talent. Whereas
Mhm.
retention allows you to hold on to these talented individuals for the long run,
Mhm.
for the long run, right?
Hopefully, fingers crossed. That's always the goal, right? Okay, so now that we have the definition of both, and thanks for setting that stage, because you're right, it is important for us to really know what we're
For sure.
talking about in terms of definition. How would you ultimately decide then if a candidate that doesn't work out at an organization is a result of A, selecting the wrong candidate in the first place, or
Mhm.
B, a result of a company's inability to retain that candidate?
I mean, I don't think there's like a super straightforward answer. I think a lot
Mhm.
of it probably just comes down to the amount of time
Yep.
that a candidate spends at a company before they leave. Like recruitment in some capacity is responsible for like shorter term retention. Like
Mhm.
recruiters are vetting candidates to ensure they have the skills that they need for the role, the experience and knowledge that hopefully translates to success at this new company, and like the intangibles as well. That would be a cultural fit for your company.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, really good point. And listen, I think when we look at this as a whole, we're not saying any of this is a one size fits all
Right.
answer, solution,
Never, never,
anything.
never.
Never ever. That's the one thing we know for sure is there's not a one size fits all solution. But I want to preface that because, like, the next point that I want to cover, this is not exactly how it happens in every single
Right.
organization, but in most, this is what happens. So after a candidate makes it through an interview process, is hired, goes through initial onboarding, typically the responsibility to retain that candidate is then passed to the internal HR team or to the hiring manager. Now, in some cases, like, sometimes recruiting hangs on to that a little bit longer. Maybe there's more
Right.
collaboration, but that is often the process of what happens.
I agree. Kind of like that responsibility is like transferred a little bit.
Mhm.
So, what are your thoughts if a candidate doesn't work out in, say, like the first month? Okay, like if we're talking like timeline, if a
Mhm.
candidate falls off, right, or leaves or doesn't work out or, the company decides it's not a fit, do you think it's due to poor recruiting or poor retention?
Similar to what I just said, every situation's a little bit different,
Yeah.
right? So this also isn't a one size fits all answer. But I do think oftentimes, if we're falling under this kind of timeline, I would probably say the mark was missed by recruiting.
I would agree with that statement. If it's like really, really short term, there was
Hmm.
probably something missed in terms of like in some cases we work with a lot of like very early stage startups, and it's like, oh, the mark's missed at the very, very beginning because
Hmm.
until you're in that startup and like, wearing multiple hats and moving in this fast paced environment, like, sometimes the mark can be missed with a candidate. Like they had the skills, they had the knowledge, they had the experience, but potentially just like the environment doesn't work
Hmm.
out in that first month. So I mean, that's just one example, of course, like you said, like we
Right.
cannot really make generalizations. There's not really a correct answer here.
Right.
Do you feel like it's maybe then safe to say that if a candidate spends like a full year at a company and leaves, their departure is then kind of more likely an effect of poor employer retention.
Completely. Yeah. And I think the reason why I say that too is, the recruiting process in many organizations, like we
Yeah,
said, there's always room for translation here, has ended pretty early on. So, like, the hiring manager is going to be
right.
responsible if the job has changed since this person stepped into it. Like, the initial phase of recruiting to find that talent would not be involved anymore. So,
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, I think if we're looking past like that initial onboarding period, then that's really more of a retention issue. And I think ultimately, if recruiters have done their job and find a great candidate, there's things that we have to think about too in terms of like how do we retain that great talent when we're passing the baton. So, and from your perspective, what are some of the ways that companies can focus on retention?
I think so important, like just like right off the bat, is effective onboarding,
Hmm.
right? Like we talk about that, like you said, kind of when the responsibility is passed, you found the talent, like setting that candidate up for success from the very, very beginning. Effective onboarding is huge. I think there's other things to look at, just like competitive total compensation, whether that's salary, bonus, commission, like think benefits, think equity, all that
Hmm.
jazz. Overall flexibility, maybe it's work from home flexibility, flexible work hours, unlimited PTO. I think just overall, like encouraging and promoting a strong work life balance, employee engagement, and also like managing for retention.
Hmm.
I feel like we could even do like a whole insight on
I think we
what
should.
managing for retention looks like.
Hmm.
I feel like many people will say the reason they're looking for a new job is because of their manager. Like we
Yep.
hear that all the time. It's leadership, it's management. Like that's the main reason for looking. So
Hmm.
I think it's really pivotal that companies like teach their managers to be effective people leaders and mentors if we're
Hmm.
talking about how to retain talent.
Yeah, all really good points. And I know we just kind of threw a lot at people in terms of like, what can we
Yeah,
do to
feel free to
retain
chime
people?
in.
It's a lot, right? But I
Yeah,
think we probably both throughout our career have had some type of candidate fall off, with one of these
unfortunately, yeah.
things being a defining factor of it, right? I think
Yeah.
ultimately, like, the flexibility piece is something that's really huge. I've heard that a number of times. I've had folks work for organizations that have been longtime partners of mine, and maybe they were in the office 3 to 4 days a week, and then they have the opportunity to work 100% remote, and having a family, that's an important
Right.
piece. Every candidate has different things that are really important to them and motivating factors in terms of staying in an organization or looking for a new job. So I think it's important to, like, on the recruiting piece, so early on, defining what those motivating factors are.
Hmm.
If you know that, like, flexibility is something that's a number one priority for a candidate, and then your organization is on site 5 days a week, even if they're a great fit for the role, maybe that's not the best long term fit for the organization because if an opportunity comes up. So I think that's where, like, the recruiting and retention piece kind of come hand in hand. There's a lot of collaboration when you think about things long term. So to kind of wrap things up, I think, when it comes down to it, it's both recruiting and retention strategies that are really important to ensure that the right talent is identified and retained long term.
Yeah, I think you're completely correct. They're both really important and like at
Mhm.
different stages, but they definitely do both work hand in hand. If anything we said kind of like sparks something for you, definitely drop it in the comments if you're like, "Oh, I would love to hear more about like what, successful onboarding looks like for long-term retention or managing for retention or whatever it is. We'd love to dive
Mhm.
deeper into any of these
Yeah.
topics."
Good point.
Yeah.
We'll take a look at the comments for sure. But I think that's going to wrap up this week's show for the Hirewell update. Great topic. Thanks for all the insights you shared.
Thank you all so much for joining us. As a reminder, you can find all of our content at talentinsights.hirewell.com. Or if you'd like to learn more about Hirewell and our service offerings, check out our website. It's www.hirewell.com. We'll see you then.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.